Good day, all. This talk will examine the Marxist approach to superheroes. For Marxists, superheroes are a media product, which, in capitalist society, is created by media corporations. These corporations have two main goals. Firstly, like all corporations, they have to make money. Any business which doesn't show a profit will soon go out of business. So superheroes have to be profitable, and they are. Both superhero comics and superhero movies have become multi-billion-dollar industries. But secondly, media corporations differ from other corporations in that they serve capitalism in a secondary manner. They spread its ruling ideology. As I said in my talk on Marxism on the media, Marxists argue that since all media, except for the internet, are corporate oligopolies, their capitalist owners make sure that they put out a steady stream of pro-capitalist messages, either overtly or covertly. Modern superhero stories may be overtly about superheroes fighting supervillains, but they too contain hidden pro-capitalist themes and ideas. I shall begin by examining the ideological function of superheroes, since ancient superheroes spread the ruling class's ruling ideology long before the rise of capitalism, and then I shall examine the economic role of superheroes in capitalism. The earliest superheroes were exaggerated versions of war heroes. As stories about these war heroes were told and retold, their feats became exaggerated over time. What began as human heroic accomplishments became superhuman heroic accomplishments. An exceptional fighter might kill 10 enemy soldiers in a battle, but when the story was retold, it became 100 soldiers, and the next time it became 1,000 enemy soldiers that he killed single-handedly. However, since such feats are normally impossible, they had to be explained. And the standard explanation was that the hero could do such things because he was the son of a god. Having a supernatural origin gave him superhuman powers. The idea that outstanding men, especially outstanding military leaders, were the sons of gods, originated with the aristocracy. Early tribes were societies of equality because the tribe was basically a family. But large agricultural societies saw the invention of the state, which was quickly taken over by the world's first ruling class, the aristocracy. The aristocracy controlled the military and ruled by force of arms. They became rich and powerful, while the peasant farmers remained poor and powerless. This enormous increase in social inequality had to be justified. And for this justification, the aristocracy turned to the priesthood. An alliance was quickly formed where the aristocracy supported the official religion with their soldiers, and in return, the priests told the people to obey their rulers because that's what the gods wanted. From its earliest days, aristocratic rule was accompanied by divine legitimation. This evolved over time. First, the priests told people that the gods had hand-picked or chosen their king to rule over them. Then, that he was an avatar or representative of a god. Then, that he was the son of a god. finally, that he was a god. This final stage is termed divine monarchy, and it appeared in ancient Egypt and Rome, where the pharaohs and emperors claimed to be gods. Superheroes emerged earlier, in that period when the aristocracy were mostly claiming to be children of gods or demigods. Since military leaders and therefore war heroes mostly came from the aristocracy, most ancient superheroes were kings and other aristocrats. Ancient superheroes, therefore, served an ideological purpose for the aristocracy, making themselves appear superhuman and invincible in battle would intimidate any potential enemies, deterring either revolt from their peasants or attack from other aristocrats. Turning themselves or their ancestors into semi-divine superheroes allowed the aristocracy to use not just religion, but also culture in the form of myths, legends, epic poems, and visual art to support their rule. So, ancient superheroes were a part of the aristocracy's ruling ideology. The earliest type of superhero was the demigod warrior king, or super aristocrat. The aristocracy were raising themselves above the common people, so they created this image of themselves as being literally superhuman compared to the peasants, especially in military ability. And basically, they were. A professional army with proper training and equipment could easily defeat a bunch of peasants armed with pitchforks. But having the peasants believe that their rulers had superpowers struck fear into them and helped to prevent peasant revolts. As war heroes, ancient superheroes both idealized the aristocracy and expressed their military ambitions. Since the aristocracy gained their wealth by conquering, looting, and plundering, they had a vested interest in going to war. But to do this, they had to gain the support of the general public. And superheroes helped with this. They helped to spread the ideology of nationalism, the belief that your nation was superior to others and so was justified in attacking and conquering them. Military victory is its own justification. If you win the war, then that proves that you were right all along. Your society is the superior one. History shows that superheroes tend to appear in groups, country by country, and that they appear at a time when that country is becoming a geopolitical superpower and building an empire. Superpowers create superheroes with superpowers. Civilization began with the invention of agriculture in Mesopotamia on the Arabian Peninsula around 5500 BC. Mesopotamia gave us the world's first city-states, and Mesopotamia gave us the world's first superhero, Gilgamesh. The Bible gave us Jewish superheroes as Israel became a power in North Africa. Ancient Greece gave us many superheroes as it created its empire, and Rome then adopted them for its empire. Then we saw the rise of Britain, which gave us superheroes from King Arthur to Sherlock Holmes as it built the British Empire. Then in the 20th century, the US became the world's superpower and gave us the comic book superheroes of the Marvel and DC universes. And finally, in the late 20th century, Japan gave the world manga and anime superheroes, showing that while Japan has not become a traditional military superpower, it has become a global economic superpower. As for Canada, the only successful Canadian superheroes are those put out by Marvel in the US. Made in Canada superheroes have generally not survived for long because Canada just is not a superpower. Historical studies show that the benefits of establishing an empire go almost exclusively to the ruling class. The average person gains little or no material benefit from these foreign conquests. However, buying into a nationalist ruling ideology may provide subjective benefits in the form of strong national pride. When a nation realizes that it has become an international leader, traditionally by conquering all of its neighbors, then it tends to develop a national superiority complex. Its citizens start to believe that they are better than everyone else just because they're citizens of a superpower. You can see this in all the societies I just mentioned. For example, traditional Judaism says that the Jews are God's chosen people, that God has raised them above all other nations. The British introduced the racist concept of the white man's burden, which said that since the British white man was superior, it was his duty to conquer the darker-skinned nations since he knew how to run their lives better than they did for themselves. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the American attitude of, we're number one. The US is the greatest country in the world. It's a shining example to the world. Everyone should try to be just like the US and should follow the US's lead in all things. The rest of the world tends to find this attitude arrogant, which has led to the stereotype of the ugly American or obnoxious American, as personified perfectly by former US President Donald Trump. So, when a nation realizes that it has become a superpower, it wants to express its feelings of superiority in cultural terms. One of the ways it does that is by creating superheroes. Early superheroes were all based on the real-life heroes of that nation, who would have their status raised posthumously by giving them superhuman abilities which kept growing as the story was told and retold. Building up the nation's heroes was a cultural component of the process of nation building. Nations gave their heroes superpowers as an expression of national identity. You feel superior, so you invent superior people to symbolize your nation. However, it can also serve the practical purpose of weakening your enemy's resolve. If you can get your enemies to believe, even a little bit, that you really do have superheroes fighting on your side, then you'll have made them afraid, undermined their morale, made them more likely to surrender or lose. Which shows us that superheroes can be powerful in the real world too. However, ancient superheroes were created in stories told and retold mostly by the peasants or common people. For them, ancient superheroes were folk heroes, whose main job was, or should be, to protect the common people from monsters and enemies. They embodied the basic class relationship of agricultural society. The peasants grew the food, the aristocracy provided the protection. The peasants often made superhero stories into cautionary stories for the aristocracy. Ancient myths repeatedly tell of superheroes who get too proud and abuse their power and are punished for it by the gods. There's a straight line between the very earliest superhero stories and the most famous line in modern superhero comics. As Uncle Ben said to Spider-Man, "With great power, there must come great responsibility." The people accept the authority of their king as long as he accepts the responsibility of looking after his people. So, ancient superhero stories express the interests of the peasants as well as the aristocracy. Modern superheroes contribute to capitalism's ruling ideology in several ways. Most obviously, they portray rich capitalists like Bruce Wayne, Batman, and Tony Stark, Iron Man, as superheroes who spend their money and risk their lives to save the average person. In the 2017 Justice League movie, when Bruce Wayne is asked what his superpower is, he says, "I'm rich." The message is clear. Money is the real superpower in today's world. You don't have to be from the planet Krypton to do things that ordinary people cannot. You just have to have a ton of money. Bruce Wayne, billionaire industrialist, is a modern version of the traditional upper-class superhero, using his money and risking his life to fight crime, something that real-life capitalists, of course, never do. While real-life superheroes have existed for some 30 years now, no rich business person has ever come forward to join their ranks. But while the high moral standards attributed to capitalist superheroes may be fictional, the great social power attributed to money is not. Like Batman, Iron Man is a billionaire, so he essentially has unlimited money to spend on his super technology. Like Batman, he's a member of the rich upper class who spends his money and risks his life to save ordinary working class people. As such, they both serve the ideological purpose of presenting the capitalist class in a positive light. Not only that, but Iron Man links today's capitalist ruling class to the old ruling class, the aristocracy, because Iron Man is, of course, a modern knight in armor. A knight's armor made him effectively superhuman in battle compared to those without armor. Iron Man is based on the medieval figure of the knight-errant, a knight who went around helping people and fighting bad guys and having adventures. Modern superheroes are also ideological in more subtle ways. Firstly, where ancient superheroes put the focus on politics, modern superheroes take the focus off politics. Unlike ancient superheroes, modern superheroes are usually not political leaders and generally do not even get involved in political issues. Superheroes have been depoliticized. Instead of providing solutions to social problems through the state, they do it as individuals. One of the reasons for the popularity of superheroes in the US is that they fit into the traditional US value of individualism. Individualism is a big part of US culture, and superheroes are outstanding and unique individuals. They support the belief that individuals can accomplish great things, and indeed that all or most great things are accomplished by remarkable individuals rather than through collective action or the state. When superheroes catch criminals, they show that they can do it better than a state-run organization, the police. The private individual, which in practice means the private business or corporation, succeeds where the public sector fails. In the movie Iron Man 2, Tony Stark takes this to the next level when he refuses to give his Iron Man technology to the US military and instead declares, "I have privatized peace." The private supercorporation has brought peace where the government could not. The problem with this is that it's not possible. Wars are fought between states or governments, and so they cannot be resolved by private corporations. Moreover, privatization of state functions has in practice done far more harm than good. For example, as I said in my talks on healthcare, the privatization of the US healthcare system has been a disaster for the health of all but the rich. Similarly, the partial privatization of the US's police and prison systems since the 1980s has led to the rise of a criminal justice system that is not only more expensive and less accountable than the public sector, it is much more violent, and so turns many non-violent offenders into violent offenders. Moreover, not only is privatization of government services generally not a good idea, neither is glorifying the individual. Karl Marx argued that capitalists want everyone to be an individual because the only thing that capital fears is collective action. Individuals cannot challenge the rule of big corporations. Only a lot of people working together can do that. But people are not going to get together if everyone is being an individual and doing their own thing. Individualism supports the rule of the capitalist class by fragmenting and isolating people. It is an ideological form of the old divide and conquer strategy. Modern superheroes are often referred to as crime fighters. But this focus on crime is also ideological. As US Marxist criminologist Jeffrey Ryman has argued, capitalists have used the criminal justice system and the modern media to blow the problem of crime wildly out of proportion. In the US, the first story on the evening news is almost always a violent crime story. If it bleeds, it leads, is the slogan. This gives the impression that violent crime is much more widespread than it really is. This also breaks people up. If you're afraid of your neighbor, then you're not going to get together with your neighbor to fight for your rights. Crime-fighting superheroes serve the same purpose as TV shows like CSI, Law and Order, and so on, in giving the impression that crime is our biggest social problem. While crime is certainly a social problem, it's actually a much smaller problem than the problems caused by capitalism, unemployment, poverty, inequality, and various forms of social injustice. Crime has been used by the capitalists as a distraction for the general public and as a scapegoat for society's problems. As Ryman argues, as long as people are worrying about the mugger on the street corner, they're not worrying about the corporate CEOs who are really ripping off the public. Superheroes can also represent the interests of the working class, but it's more difficult for them to do so. When Superman first appeared, he was a social crusader, fighting for the average worker against crooked businessmen and corrupt politicians. But the US establishment found this too threatening, and his focus was changed to fighting criminals, first through editorial decree and later enforced by the Comics Code Authority, the CCA. The CCA in particular did everything in its power to make comic book superheroes conservative and non-political, respecting established authority and the rights of private property. However, superheroes do not have to be that way. Real-life superheroes have been inspired by comic book superheroes to fight not for the rich, but for the average person and for the poor. Also, I would argue that in a more subtle but fundamental way, superheroes, by their very nature, challenge the ruling ideology and serve an anti-ideological function. I would argue that every ideology is ultimately based on trying to persuade people that, for whatever reason, things have to be the way they are. There is no viable alternative, so people should support the status quo. The CCA tried to make superheroes into supporters of the status quo. But the problem with this is that superheroes do not fit in to the status quo. Superheroes break the mold. They do the impossible. They show that things do not have to be the way they are. Comics analyst Neil Curtis says superheroes take us, quote, beyond the current state of affairs, and so call on us to change things. Superheroes transcend reality. They show that tomorrow can be different and better than today. They show that we do not have to accept today's injustices because they can be overcome. It just takes a heroic effort. I shall conclude my look at the Marxist approach to superheroes with a brief examination of the economics of superheroes. Marxism argues that in capitalism, every industry follows the same historical pattern. It begins with the establishment of many small businesses, usually family businesses, but over time, growth, bankruptcies, mergers, and takeovers lead to a concentration of capital into a corporate oligopoly. In other words, a large number of small companies become concentrated into a small number of large corporations. This pattern has definitely been followed by the comics industry. Comics, including superhero comics, originated in the US in the 1930s. By the 40s, there were about 60 comic book publishers. Not all published superhero comics, but the majority did. But the 50s saw a decline in sales, which led to a wave of bankruptcies. By the 60s, only 10 publishers remained, and today only 3 of them are still in business, all of which have changed their names and their owners since they were originally established. They are DC, which was originally named National Allied Publications, or NAP, Marvel, originally named Timely Comics, and Archie Comics, originally named MLJ Comics. Since Archie Comics focuses on humor rather than superheroes, DC and Marvel established a duopoly on superhero comics. By the 90s, they had over 80% of the US comics market between them. However, the resurgence of interest in superheroes meant that the 90s saw the establishment of a fresh wave of independent comics publishers. Some of these companies have failed, but others, like Image and Dark Horse, have prospered and have taken a small bite out of DC and Marvel's market share. In 2019, Marvel had 40% and DC had 29%, so just 69% together, down from a high of over 80%. Still, DC and Marvel continue to dominate the superhero market. Superhero comics were created by a small US publisher named National Allied Publications, or NAP. NAP started out publishing books with collected reprints of newspaper comic strips, then announced it wanted to publish original comic books. NAP published the first original comic book in 1935 entitled New Fun. It featured the debut of a superhero named Dr. Occult. He was a private detective who had magic powers that were incredibly powerful. In 1938, Nap debuted Superman in Action Comics #1. In 1939, Timely Comics published their first comic, which was called Marvel Comics, a name that was adopted by the company in 1961. Nap went through several name changes and ownership changes before being bought in 1969 by Warner Brothers, which changed its name to DC Comics in 1977. So the DC-Marvel rivalry was originally the Nap-Timely rivalry, and it goes right back to the beginning of superhero comics. Superhero comic sales have waxed and waned in cyclical fashion in the US. Their popularity grew slowly through the late 30s, then accelerated during World War II from 1939 to 45. However, that popularity declined dramatically after the war ended, and many comic lines were cancelled. Partly, this decline was due to a growth in public concern that comic book violence was setting a bad example for America's youth. In response, comic book publishers formed the Comics Code Authority, the CCA, in 1954. This imposed a conservative moral code on comics which eased public concern and boosted sales. The 60s then saw the rise of Marvel under the leadership of Stan Lee. Stan Lee took superhero comics beyond their original fan base of children and created an adult fan base by creating more adult characters and storylines. By the late 60s, Marvel and DC combined to sell over 100 million copies per year. But in the mid-70s, the comics industry experienced distribution problems to the newsstands where comics were traditionally sold. Sales fell, not for lack of demand, but for lack of supply. In response to these problems, the late 70s saw a swift rise in the number of new specialty comic book stores. In the mid-70s, there were only about 25 such stores in the US. By 1990, there were over 5,000. These stores remain the main sales outlet for comics to this day. However, after their initial surge of popularity, these stores saw comic sales decline through the 90s. Superman #75, released in November 1992, which featured the temporary death of Superman at the hands of Doomsday, sold over 6 million copies. The best-selling comic of all time. However, after that, sales declined, and by 2016, sales were down to just over 30,000 copies per issue. Similarly, in the late 60s, Marvel was selling an average of 230,000 copies per title per month. By the mid-90s, this was down to about 80,000 copies. In 1996, Marvel had to file for bankruptcy protection. However, the following year, 1997, Marvel merged with Toy Biz, a toy company that made Marvel action figures. This finally put Marvel on a solid financial footing and enabled it to begin making superhero movies. These movies greatly increased the popularity of superheroes, especially Marvel superheroes, and this translated into greater sales of superhero comics. In 2021, about 95 million comics were sold in the US. The superhero comics industry has also been very effective in marketing comics as collectibles. This particularly applies to debut issues. Marvel Comics #1, published in 1939, which featured the debuts of Namor the Submariner and the Human Torch, originally sold for 10 cents, but in 2019, one copy sold for $1.74 million. Batman first appeared in Detective Comics #27 in 1939, and one issue of this comic sold in 2020 for $2.22 million. Superman debuted in Action Comics #1, published in 1938, and in 2014, one copy sold for $3.25 million. Finally, Spider-Man debuted in 1962 in Amazing Fantasy #15, and in 2021, one copy of this comic sold for $3.6 million, becoming the most expensive comic of all time so far. DC and Marvel have both cashed in on the popularity of debut issues by creating more debuts through their policies of introducing periodic reboots. For example, in 1996, Marvel cancelled all of its major titles and reissued them beginning at #1 under the title Heroes Reborn. Then, in 1997, they did it again under the title Heroes Return. This allowed them to have 2 sets of first and last issues, which boosted sales and increased their value as collectibles. The marketing of superheroes has been transformed by the evolution of comics into graphic novels. A graphic novel is just a long comic with a stiffer cover. However, their difference lies in their greater longevity. Like magazines, comics are put on the stands for relatively brief periods of time, being replaced by the next edition. While some people become avid collectors, most readers view them as transient publications to be consumed and then disposed of. Graphic novels, on the other hand, are thought of as books. They're given long-term space on comic stores' shelves, are also sold by bookstores, and are collected as books by consumers. This has resulted in graphic novels gaining a larger market share than comic books. Comic books and graphic novels both first appeared in the 1930s. Originally, they were both compilations of short strips which appeared in newspapers or magazines. In Europe, Hergé's Adventures of Tintin were an immediate success, and they remain popular to this day. Tintin is a non-superpowered superhero, solving crimes and battling evil all over the world. Like Clark Kent, he's a journalist. But in practice, he operates as a detective, like Batman. Indeed, with his perennial sidekick, Captain Haddock, he provides a curiously inverted version of Batman and Robin. The cheerful, eternally teenaged Tintin, or Robin, takes the lead, while the older, darker Haddock, or Batman, provides him with support. In North America, graphic novels were slower to catch on. They first began to appear in the 40s, but did not become popular until Marvel started putting out a few as one-offs in the 60s. American Richard Kyle only coined the term graphic novel in 1964. Sales of graphic novels continued to grow through the 70s, then really took off in the 80s when they were fully embraced by Marvel and DC. Marvel put out a line of original graphic novels from 1982 to 88. DC most notably published Batman: The Dark Knight Returns in 1986 and The Watchmen from 1986 to 87. They also began to regularly issue collected comics as graphic novels. Today, all major superheroes normally appear first in comics and then in graphic novels. Indeed, writers have taken to creating storylines which last from 4 to 12 comics, knowing that these will ultimately be published as a single graphic novel or as a series of 3 or 4. Since graphic novels are more durable, superhero readers have steadily switched over to this format. In 2013, income from graphic novels overtook that from comics. And in 2021, graphic novels had about 70% of the income from this market. Moreover, the growth in popularity of graphic novels has contributed to greatly increasing the income from superhero printed materials. In the year 2000, such sales totaled about $250 million. In 2021, they totaled about $2 billion. However, this increase in the sales of superhero printed materials is primarily due to the explosive growth in the popularity of superhero movies in the 21st century. Movies make much more money than comics because they have a much bigger audience. In 2013, DC and Marvel sold about 7 million comics a month to an estimated audience of about 2 million North American comics fans. But in that year, an estimated 60 million people in North America went to see DC and Marvel movies. Marvel movies began with Blade in 1998 and the X-Men in the year 2000. This was the start of a string of blockbusters which culminated in Avengers Endgame in 2019, which smashed box office records in earning over $2.8 billion. However, Marvel's transition to the movies was not simple. In order to get out of their 1996 bankruptcy, Marvel had to sell the movie rights to some of their characters fairly cheaply to movie studios. For example, Sony bought Spider-Man, Universal got the Hulk, and 20th Century Fox got the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and Daredevil. Their movies were successful, but Marvel got very little of the money. So, in 2004, Marvel launched its own movie studio, Marvel Studios, to create the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU. Its first release was Iron Man in 2008. From that movie to the 22nd MCU movie, Avengers Endgame, released in 2019, Marvel movies went through a single, interconnected story arc with a single generation of actors. The creation of so many interconnected movies is unprecedented in the history of motion pictures, but it follows the standard comic format, where each comic book has a standalone adventure, but there's also a long-term story arc which links them together, especially through crossovers and super teams like the Avengers. The MCU's long-term story arc has been overseen by Kevin Feige, who is president of Marvel Studios and in effect the 21st century's Stan Lee. By 2019, Marvel Studios movies had generated total worldwide gross box office sales of over $22 billion, making them the highest grossing US movie franchise. The success of these superhero movies made both Marvel and DC more valuable and so more attractive to the bigger entertainment corporations. In 2009, Disney bought Marvel for over $4 billion. DC was bought by Warner Brothers in 1969, which in turn was bought by AT&T, the largest telecommunications company in the world, in 2018 for over $85 billion. So, the Marvel-DC rivalry has now become part of the larger Disney-AT&T rivalry. Being bought by Disney gave Marvel virtually unlimited funds to make the later expensive, high-tech, multi-star movies like the Avengers series. And in 2019, Disney bought 20th Century Fox, essentially giving Marvel back the rights to the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, who will presumably be integrated into the MCU over the coming years. Superhero movies promise to continue being very profitable for many years to come. That concludes what I have to say on the Marxist approach to superheroes. A transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.